Hello friends, this video on Kingdom Plantae Part 22 is brought to you by examfear.com. No more fear from exam. So now let us try to understand how does sexual reproduction occur in plants. So this process is a 4-step process. The 4 steps together will complete the process of sexual reproduction in plants. So these are the 4 steps: pollination, fertilization, seed formation and germination. So these 4 steps together will complete the process of sexual reproduction. So let us try to understand each of these steps in detail one by one. So we will start with pollination. So what is pollination? So what is this process of pollination? It is the process of transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. So where are the pollen grains present right now? These are the male gametes. So it is present inside the male reproductive organ. What is male reproductive organ? Which is the male reproductive organ? It is the stamen. So in stamen, where are these present? These are present in the pollen sacs. And where are the pollen sacs present? In anther. So these pollen grains need to be transferred from anther to the female reproductive organ, that is stigma. So this transfer of pollen grain is known as pollination. So that has to be the first step, because only after the pollen grains can reach the female reproductive organ, only then the fusion between the male and female gametes can happen. So this process of transfer is known as pollination. Now this transfer can happen from anther to stigma of the same flower, or it can happen from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower. So both are possible. So depending upon whether the pollen grains are transferred from anther to stigma of the same flower or of different flower, the process of pollination is divided into 2 types. Self-pollination, that means when the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of the same flower. And cross-pollination, when pollen grains are transferred from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower. So that is cross-pollination. That means cross-pollination will happen between one flower and another flower. Self-pollination will happen with the same flower. When I talk about self-pollination, in that case, the flower which I am talking about is mostly bisexual. That means that flower will have both the male part as well as the female part. When I am talking about cross-pollination, it is mostly seen in unisexual flowers, which flowers have either the male part or the female part. Now the question is, how will this transfer take place? How will the pollen grains be carried from anther to the stigma? Who will carry the pollen grains? So this transfer takes place with the help of pollinating agents like wind, water, insects, birds. So these things act as pollinating agents which actually carry the pollen grains from anther to stigma. So now you understand why insects are so important for flowers. Why do flowers want to attract insects? Because if insects come to the flowers, they will help in carrying the pollen grains from anther to stigma, and therefore they will help in the process of pollination. So the colorful petals of a flower attracts insects. Insects come there. They act as pollinating agents. Right? So this is the first step for sexual reproduction, that is pollination. Now let us look at the next step, that is fertilization. So this is a unique feature of angiosperms. So when I talk about angiosperms, we will see that in angiosperms the fertilization which occurs is a double fertilization. So we will just now talk about what is double fertilization. But before that, let us try to understand what is fertilization. Fertilization is nothing but the fusion of the male gamete and the female gamete. That is the fusion of the pollen grain and the egg. So by the process of pollination, the pollen grains will reach the stigma of the flower. So that part is okay. Once it reaches the stigma, it will travel through the style. So now the pollen grain has reached the stigma. So here it is already there. Now the pollen grain will travel through the style and it will reach the ovary. So once it reaches the ovary, inside the ovary is the ovule, and inside ovule is the egg cell. So these pollen grains will then reach the egg cell and it will fuse with the egg cell. So this fusion of pollen grain with the egg is known as fertilization. So now the question is, what is double fertilization? Now when I talk about one pollen grain is basically two male gametes. So there are two male gametes which are produced in this pollen tube. So this tube-like structure which is formed in the style when the pollen grains pass through it is known as pollen tube, and these are the male sex cells. So these male sex cells will reach the ovary. Now once it reaches the ovary, what will happen? Now you have two male gametes. So one male gamete will fuse with the egg which is present in the ovary. So that is one thing. That is one fertilization is done. What happens to the other male sex cell which is there? Now inside the ovary, now if we look at the structure of the ovary, inside the ovary we have one sex cell and we also have a secondary nucleus there. So let us try to see that. Now fusion of the pollen grain, that is one male gamete and egg, will result in the formation of zygote. Now what will happen to the other male gamete? So the other male gamete will fuse with the secondary nucleus which is present inside the ovary, and the result is PEN. What is PEN? It is primary endosperm nucleus. So we will talk about that little later. So here what I am trying to say is that if you look at the structure inside this ovule, so what happens inside the ovule? Let us try to understand the structure inside the ovule. Now inside the ovary we have ovule. So this entire swollen structure is ovary and this inner structure is ovule, and inside the ovule what do we have? We have the female gametophyte. So female gametophyte is the one which produces the female gametes. So what is the female gametophyte known as? It is the embryo sacs. So this actually produces one egg cell and two polar nuclei. So inside the female gametophyte you have one egg cell and two polar nuclei. Now these two polar nuclei will fuse together to form a secondary nucleus. So now basically inside the ovule you have one egg cell and one secondary nucleus. Now through this pollen tube two male sex cells will be coming. So one male gamete will combine with this egg cell and the other second male gamete will combine with this secondary nucleus. So therefore two fusions will take place, and that is why it is known as double fertilization. So one fusion between the pollen and the egg, the other fusion between the pollen and the secondary nucleus. So by fusion of the male gamete and the egg, the result is the zygote. And by fusion of the pollen and the secondary nucleus, the result is the PEN. What is PEN? It is primary endosperm. So let us see what is PEN. It is primary endosperm nucleus. It is a triploid cell. That means it has 3 sets of chromosomes. Why it is triploid cell? Because it is formed by fusion of a male gamete, which is a haploid cell, plus a secondary nucleus. And what is secondary nucleus? It is formed by fusion of 2 polar nuclei. So that means the secondary nucleus is a diploid. So a haploid and a diploid fuse together, so they form triploid. So what is the purpose of this PEN? Now as the zygote matures, what happens to the zygote? Now as the zygote matures, it will form the embryo and then it will form the new plant. And what happens to this PEN? This PEN will mature and it will develop into endosperm. The purpose of this endosperm is to provide nourishment to the embryo. So now you understand the process of fertilization which take place inside angiosperms. In angiosperms, what will happen? By the process of pollination, pollen grains will reach the stigma. Then the pollen grain will form a pollen tube through the style, and then they will try to reach the ovary. Now there are 2 male gametes. And inside the ovary there is one egg cell and two polar nuclei. The two polar nuclei will fuse together to form a diploid secondary nucleus. Now these male sex cells, when they reach the ovule, one male sex cell will fuse with the egg to form the zygote, and the other male sex cell will fuse with the secondary nucleus to form the triploid primary endosperm nucleus. On maturity, the zygote will form the embryo and this PEN will form the endosperm. So the endosperm's function is to provide nourishment to the embryo. That it helps in the growth of the embryo. So this is the second and the most important step in the process of reproduction. So the next is the seed formation. So what happens in seed formation? Zygote divides repeatedly to form embryo. As I said, the zygote will start dividing to form embryo. And then ovule develops a thick coat and forms the seed. So which was ovule so far? This was ovule. So this ovule will now become the seed. And the ovary ripens to form the fruit. So the ovary now becomes the fruit. Inside the ovary was present the ovule. So that ovule becomes seed. So this is the seed now. And if you look at the structure inside the seed, it will have a small plumule which will later become the shoot. It will have a small radicle which will later become the roots, and it will have the cotyledons which will decide the structure of the leaves of the plant. So this is how seed formation take place. And the last step is germination. What happens is in germination, it is the development of a seedling from a seed. So from the seed, if you give it proper water and everything, so it will gradually grow into a new plant. So this seed will gradually grow to a new plant. So this process is known as germination. Now when you look at the embryo which is present inside the seed, so this embryo remains dormant for a long time. So only under favorable condition it forms seedling, and then the seedling turns into a plant. So favorable condition is very, very important for the process of germination. So I hope that now you understand how the process of sexual reproduction takes place in angiosperms. So let us now have a quick overview of whatever we studied so far. So in a quick note, in a mature plant, what do we have? Which is the reproductive structure? It is the flower. So in the flower, you have the male reproductive organ and the female reproductive organ. So the pollen grains will be transferred to the stigma by the process of pollination. Now once it reaches the stigma, then it will enter into the ovary where fertilization will take place. That is, what will happen in the process of fertilization? A zygote will be formed and a primary endosperm nucleus will be formed. Now after fertilization, seed formation will take place. How seed formation will take place? This zygote will develop into an embryo, and this primary endosperm will develop into endosperm. And this endosperm will keep on providing nourishment to the embryo so the embryo can grow. And then once that embryo starts growing, the ovule becomes the seed and the ovary becomes the fruit. So the ovule becomes the seed and the ovary becomes the fruit. Now, once the seed formation takes place, then the seed will germinate to form a seedling, and then that seedling will grow to become a plant again. So that is how the cycle will take place. So let us look at this life cycle in even more detail. Let us suppose if this is the plant. Now, which is the dominant phase in an angiosperm? It is again the sporophyte, because these plants contain the spores. What are spores? Spores are in the form of the pollen grains. So this is the sporophyte. And which is the reproductive part? Flower. So in flower, if you look at the female reproductive part, it is the stigma style ovary. If you look at the male reproductive part, it is the anther and the filament. So this will give rise to the microspore mother cell. So microspores, microsporangium, they are all male gametes. Similarly, megaspore, megasporangium, they are all female. So from this anther will come out the microspore mother cell, which gives rise to which contains microsporangium, and they will give rise to microspores. So these microspores are nothing but the pollen grains. Similarly, from the female reproductive organ, megasporangium will form the megaspore mother cell, and this will form the egg. So this is the female gamete and this is the male gamete. Now this male gamete will be carried to the female gamete by the process of pollination, and then fusion will take place. As a result, zygote will be formed. This zygote will grow to become the embryo, and the embryo will grow further to become the plant. So this is the life cycle of an angiosperm. So here also we have a sporophyte generation and a gametophyte generation. So this is the gametophyte generation which produces the gametes. So which is the gametophyte generation? This microspore and this megaspore in female. So sporophyte generation is again the dominant phase in the life cycle of angiosperms. Thank you. Please visit www.examfear.com to watch more videos, attempt free online test, get free study material, find tutors and mentors. Thank you once again.